Okay, welcome to our second lecture on Italian and Spanish Baroque. So we were discussing how Caravaggio, really, he's our key painter for the Baroque period. So when you think of Italian Baroque, I want you to think of Caravaggio. This tenebrism of the background, this realism of the human bodies, this incorporation of the viewer essentially being right up against the picture plane. And this is an example of our Counter-Reformation of communicating these stories from the Bible, particularly with this one being a book that isn't found within the Protestant version of the Bible. So it draws people back into Christianity in that regard. And I ended with Artemisia Gentileschi, or at least I said I would continue with it tomorrow. And so let's compare her depiction of Judith slaying Holofernes. We haven't seen many females. Consider the realism of this image, especially when we compare it to Caravaggio's. So we have the tenebrism of the background, we have these realistic looking figures, they're individualized, they look like real people. But look at how Caravaggio's, he has the maidservant behind the young female who is sawing off this general's head, quite a large figure. Physically, this doesn't seem possible, especially with her angle and her size, etc. But compare how Gentileschi makes this much more realistic, where she has her maidservant holding Holofernes down, where we get this sense of weight and strength within Judith in this depiction, where she's sawing off the head, she's gripping the hair to hold the head down. He's trying to push her off, but is unable to do so with both women. So there's this real sense of realism here. Now, Artemisia Gentileschi was trained by her father, and essentially she was raped at the age of 19, and at this time period, for much of time, women wouldn't have come forth about this. And she did. She fought it, and she took him to court. I mean, she wanted him to pay for it, and it became very public. But again, she was doing what was right in this regard. And so we see that within these images of these fierce women, of these strong women. In her subject matter, she often chooses subject matter in which the women are victorious or have experienced something similar. And so she shows the gravitas of this female cutting off the head of Holofernes. So there's a psychological portrayal with her depictions, which is important to recognize of how heroic she was for her time period. But I want to come back again to the realism and how she, I would argue, excels and creates a better depiction of this scene than even our master Caravaggio. Even consider the sheets right here and how much more realistic the folds and the crumpled sheets look versus Caravaggio. The blood that's splurting out and dripping down looks more realistic than Caravaggio's depiction. So one of the things I forgot to mention with Caravaggio is he was criticized by people for drawing that he couldn't draw from his imagination and that he could only draw what was in front of him. Side note, to add on to your Caravaggio notes. But consider how realistic, coming back to Artemisia, she is for this Baroque period. The theatrical spotlight is there, our tenebrism of our background. She's able to depict all these different textures. Consider the metal of the sword, the sheets, the velvet, the different materials on their clothing, the gold jewelry, and just how much she excels as a skilled artisan. Artemisia, here's her Judith and her maidservant. And so this is another depiction of this same story, but where we're seeing after, where they're wrapping up the head to bring it to the town to show that they've been victorious over this general who's held her city under siege. So they're pausing. It's that moment of, oh, wait, she may hear something. So this sense of time that we saw with Bernini even is also indicative of the Baroque period, where we can imagine right before, we can imagine right after. We recognize that, and where it happens automatically in our brain by this little moment of that time. It's not this pause before, pause after, as we're looking at this, we picture the whole scene in our head, essentially. And again, this depiction of all these different types of textures, that she is exceedingly becoming more recognized for how good of a painter she was. Again, that moment in time, she saw Bernini's David, essentially, the curve of the body, etc. Theme of time. All right, so let's head on over to Spain. They too are fighting against the Reformation that's sweeping through Europe. This is an extremely Catholic nation as well. We have the Spanish Inquisition from 1478 to 1834, really happening during the 16th century and 17th century, where they're essentially torturing heretics, people who aren't Catholic Christians, including practicing Muslims and Jews. And so there's this sense of brutality that we see more with some of the Spanish Baroque artists, of this macabre death. So let's compare this Spanish Baroque piece when it comes compared to Caravaggio, where we have the tenebrism, we have the realism, we have the focus on the individual, the viewer right up against the picture plane. Description of him is to the side where he was a saint that was killed. And we're seeing, we empathize with this individual of this sad death. So it's drawing the viewer in. We're having an emotional reaction to this. The artwork has agency. So I also want to introduce still lifes. We'll see this more with the Northern Baroque, or with the Dutch Golden Age. We'll focus on a specific artist. But artists, we haven't seen these still lifes where they're showing their skills in depicting these different textures. I mean, consider the lemons versus the metal plate and the woven basket, and these oranges, the leaves, the other types of materials, the wood of the table that these are on, the rose. So many argue that this probably has to do with some type of Christian symbolism, considering the Trinity with this group of three. Some argue that this rose has to do with Mary, the mother of Jesus. It's hard with this lighting, but art historians have looked at it up close and noticed that there are no thorns on it. So this more pure love coming from Mary is arguable. But there's probably some more symbolism that has been lost that we just don't know about. But they're practicing these still lifes, and I remember I used to think that these were so boring. But then when you actually walk up to it, when you visit the MFA, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, I implore you to pay attention to some of the still lifes and just being able to appreciate how they're able to create these realistic looking objects with paint. I mean, we take advantage of it because we can take a picture so easily. But these, such as this one, these painters, I mean, he's using oil to create this. So it's just incredible. A way to appreciate their skills. So here's what I mean with more of this like macabre and emphasis almost on death, where we have this reclining Christ by Gregorio Fernandez. Polychromed wood, so painted wood. Consider how different this is than marble and how this looks very realistic. You probably immediately had a reaction to this wood sculpture because it is sad. It is very, I mean, there's such an emphasis on the wounds and the blood and the death, and it is more macabre in that regard. Again, kind of reflective of this time period right now with the Inquisition. And consider the counter-Reformation aspects of like showing Christ's suffering, is that he suffered for us. So let's move on to Diego Velázquez, kind of a lighter, with a genre painting. So remember genre painting, this was introduced at the end of the last unit, and this is just a scene of everyday life. There's nothing symbolic here, there's no religious symbolism here. It's simply a painting of everyday life. This is the Water Cellar of Seville, 1618 to 22. And we were talking about still lifes a moment ago and see the aspects of that here, where he's showing the glass and the different types of pottery, this rougher surface versus this smoother surface of the glazed pottery, the clothing. This rip was intentional. That was a little popular style. Consider like girls a few years ago, it was like the keyhole on the shoulder somewhere. But this realistic figure, where we can see that he's influenced by Caravaggio, where we have the tenebrism, the realistic figures. We aren't seeing the nobility. We're seeing these normal people. There's this celebration of this. He has different variations of these. Consider how this one he has a hat, this one we see the water dripping down, this one has a smoother glaze here, a shinier glaze. And so he's showing off his skills. Now, Diego Velázquez became a court painter to the Habsburg family in Spain. Now, the Habsburgs were one of these main ruling families across Europe. They ruled for a long, long time. And so here we see King Philip IV. You can always tell a Habsburg by their very pale skin, these protruding lips, these red lips that protrude out. Key indicator, like many of these ancient royal families, is there was a lot of essentially inbreeding to keep the bloodline pure. The last of the Habsburg line didn't end so well. Lots of examples of what happens with essentially incest. But they're one of the most powerful ruling families for centuries. And so here we have Diego Velázquez, who has been hired as the official court painter at the Prado Museum in Spain, one of the most famous museums in the world. They have so many, oh my gosh, these are massive paintings of Velázquez, who's painted the royal family. So many, so it's a really neat museum. But we have our clearly Baroque elements in those other ones. However, I want to focus on this key work of Las Meninas. A few years ago, there was this, every decade or so, they'll ask art historians or museum workers for the top 10 best artworks in the world. And this one oftentimes makes the list. For various reasons. And most of all, think back to Mona Lisa and our Arnolfini portrait, there's this sense of mystery. And so you may pick up on some of those aspects here. So Las Meninas means the Maids of Honor. He's the foremost Spanish painter of the Spanish Baroque style. And so what we're seeing here is where he is elevating himself, the status of the artist, where he is depicting himself amongst the royal princess. He is painting a massive, this is what I mean by these large portraits, a massive portrait of the king and queen. Here's the mirror image. Think back to our Arnolfini, that mirror image. Now, yes, our central figure is the princess. Light draws our eyes toward her. She is the spotlight. You can see why the king loved this painting. He ended up keeping it in his personal study where he could look at it a lot, of his only surviving heir, essentially, of the Infantana Margarita of Spain. She's about the age of 5 right here. And so she's being helped out by her attendants. This attendant seems to be offering her something. I've seen it described as a glass of water. The other attendant is here. Other members of the court are over here. The Habsburgs employed many dwarfs. You'll see, if you ever make it to the Prado, you'll see many paintings of dwarfs within their royal court. You see this dog here. We see these other two figures behind them. This figure, these two, and Velázquez. And so there's this sense of grouping that we have here, in 3s or 2s. But anyway, so we have the Princess Margarita. She is our eyes are drawn toward her because of the light. They're closest to the picture plane, so again, our attention is drawn to her for that. And yeah, yes, the focus is on her, but consider how he's also focusing on himself and his ability as a painter, where he is in the same plane, the same picture plane as the princess, and where he's showing himself painting one of the most powerful couples in history. So he had tragically lost his first wife and heir, and so this is Margarita was through his second wife that he was celebrating, We have this individual coming from back here. And so there's all these other paintings that surround him. There's some of Rubens, a master that we'll study of the Baroque period. And so he's elevating his own artistic skill to these other known masters. There's an argument by several art historians that our focal point is with these orthogonals is not on the king or queen. It's not on the Princess Margarita, but it's back here on this individual who seems to be walking in, and particularly on the background behind him. This is a stretch, but some art historians argue that it helps that he's drawing our focus to the canvas, this blank canvas behind him, and how he, the artist, has created everything else. So the contrast helps to point out his own skill and his ability, how he's showing off here, essentially. Another argument for why he's showing off is because of this cross on his chest, and this was added later. It was the Order of Santiago when he was elevated to knighthood, and so he's now on the level of the nobility. And so he adds this later to show his elevated status. So essentially, it helps to elevate Diego Velázquez as well. And there's the size of it. Court painter. I should mention he visited after his first visit to Rome. Close up. Now, one thing you may notice is he has a little bit of these softer, looser brush strokes compared to like Caravaggio. He developed this later in his career. Different lighting. It's a lightened version. And so we'll wrap up with Murillo Bartolome. He, I don't know why I have two names there. I'll update it on the handout. Anyway, so we have Murillo. Oh, it's his full name, sorry. He goes by Murillo. I ended up adding his full name. Bartolome Esteban Murillo. Two Women at a Window. And I love this piece. He's another famous Spanish Baroque artist because it's just purely a genre painting, and where we completely empathize with these two individuals, and we can see she's making eye contact, looking out the window with someone, or looking at someone, observing, and where this female right here, perhaps her maidservant or a servant in general, is giggling, and she's trying to cover up the giggle, and just how incredibly realistic this looks, how we still see this scene today, how we have been these people before, where we recognize these emotions. It's just so relevant to humanity, where we've all witnessed something and tried to cover it up, and how it just looks like such a natural, playful scene. And again, so this genre painting, there's nothing religious about it, there's no symbolism. It's simply a celebration of everyday life, of something normal. The Baroque tenebrism, the realism, and just I like ending on this one for our Spanish Baroque. So here is, I include him in Spanish art because he worked in Spain, but this is El Greco. And so his name means the Greek, where he actually came from Greece. And so we're going to study him because of how many influences he has later on artists that we're more familiar with, and as well as to see this unique style. So here's one of his earlier works, Christ Healing the Blind, where we have our, think back to the Renaissance, he's looking to these masters, we have our linear perspective, this one-point perspective, we have our classical elements throughout, even contrapposto pose, these outfits. But already we're starting to see this little bit of a difference, this sketchy quality, these looser brush strokes. This was an unfinished piece, we can see that here, because the floor behind them. But we'll notice how his style shifts and changes, where this one has these classical elements, but some slight differences. Looks a little rougher. Here's Christ carrying the cross. some argue that this is Renaissance, some argue these are Baroque. I keep it under Baroque because of the differences between the rationality and order of and clear classical elements of the Renaissance. But we're starting to see this elongation of the fingers and the body and the hands, and just the body in general. But things still look relatively realistic. But these rougher brush strokes, these looser brush strokes. And we start to see some mannerist elements, right? Where we have these elongated bodies, the color palette becomes different, this crowded composition, the Baroque sense of the lack of a background. And so here we start to see what becomes recognizably El Greco, with these really elongated bodies in these interesting colors, to say the least, these grays, these contrasting colors. This is the burial of Count Orgaz. We see the normal triangular composition between these holy figures, but a very different take on especially the color palette of these holy figures. His attention to detail is obviously evident, and so we know that he's explicitly choosing to deviate from the norm later on with his looser brush strokes, etc., and lack of realism to come. So here's Madonna and Child with St. Martina and St. Agnes, and these bodies that almost seem distorted. Here's El Greco, St. Martin and the Beggar, this really elongated body. This is View of Toledo, 1598 to 99, and I want you to pay attention to this one because it influences Paul Cézanne, a later impressionist. And he, when you go to the MFA, try to find his work, because one of his versions of this scene is at our museum. And so he's clearly influenced by El Greco, this View of Toledo, a very famous painter we'll study. So this landscape painting, the grays, the color palette, it's extremely different. Here's El Greco Laocoon. So Laocoon is an ancient story of ancient Greece having to do with Troy, the fall of Troy. And here we see, so it's a very classical subject matter, but look at how different he depicts this. This is El Greco. These gray figures, they're super elongated. Things look very hazy and blurry, and these softer brush strokes, and almost this sketch-like quality, and how differently he's depicting the human body. It looks like a much more modern painting, not one that we would think of with the 17th century. Adoration of the Shepherds. So the Prado has a ton of his works as well. He also influences Picasso. We'll study this work, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, a Cubist piece, where over here is El Greco's The Opening of the Fifth Seal, oil on canvas, and where he clearly saw it. Picasso's Spanish, he had seen these artworks. So he's pulling from those elements. Okay, there's our ending to Spanish Baroque.